They mocked the old Oliver. He bought. He never told them what he found inside. Some men talk about what they know. Other men let what they know talk for them. Denny Carver was the second kind. Had been his whole life. Grew up in a house where his father said what needed saying and nothing past that. Where the work spoke and the results spoke and the opinions of neighbors were noted and filed and occasionally proven wrong over time without anyone pointing at the proof. He carried that quality into his farming life, and it served him well. And it served him best in the spring of 1996, when he drove home from a farm sale in Pickaway County, Ohio, with a 1952 Oliver 88 diesel on a borrowed trailer, and the better part of the county already deciding it was the dumbest thing he'd done in 32 years of farming. He never corrected them. He never had to. Part 1. The Oliver 88 and what people knew about it. To understand why people laughed, you have to understand what Oliver was in 1996 to the average person standing in a farm sale crowd in central Ohio. The Oliver Farm Equipment Company had not existed as an independent entity since 1960, when it had been absorbed into White Motor Company along with Cockshut and Minneapolis Moline. White Farm Equipment had run the Oliver brand through a succession of corporate owners and identities. White Oliver, White Farm, then simply White, until White Farm Equipment filed for bankruptcy in 1985. The brand and assets had eventually ended up with A.G. Show in the early 1990s, and the Oliver name itself had largely faded from active production, becoming one of those vintage mark names that existed in memory and in the old machines still scattered across Midwest farms. People who knew Oliver equipment really knew it. The way men who'd used it knew it, tended to have strong opinions in both directions. The Oliver 88 in particular had a following among people who'd run them, because the 88 was genuinely a good machine. Introduced in 1947, it was a row crop tractor in the 60 horsepower class, available in gasoline, diesel, and LP gas configurations, with a reputation for being well-engineered and durable. The diesel version used Oliver's own six-cylinder engine, a solid unit that shared the marque's general reputation for good engineering. But Oliver had also been out of the major dealership network for over a decade by 1996, and parts availability had become the thing people talked about when the subject of old Olivers came up. Not impossible. There were Oliver specialists, and the parts supply was actually better than the reputation suggested, particularly through restoration suppliers who had recognized the growing collector interest. But in the perception of the average farmer standing at a sale who'd spent the last 30 years watching his neighbors buy green and red iron with full dealer support behind it, Oliver meant orphan. Oliver meant you were on your own when something broke. The specific machine Denny bought at the Pickaway County sale was not an unknown quantity to the people present. It had belonged to the Schlabach operation, which meant it had provenance. The Schlabachs were a farming family that went back several generations in the county and had been Oliver customers since the late 40s. This particular 88 diesel had been on their farm since 1954, purchased new by Lester Schlabach, who had died in 1989 and whose estate sale this partially was. It had sat in the Schlabach barn for the better part of 7 years, not because it was broken but because Lester's sons had moved immediately to larger modern equipment and had no use for a 42-year-old row crop tractor, however well it might have run at the time it was put away. 7 years of sitting in a barn in Ohio. That was the condition. The bidding started at $500. Nobody in the crowd was particularly interested at $500. The auctioneer went to $400, still quiet. He dropped to $250, and a farmer in the back who'd been eyeing it for parts made a tentative bid. And then Denny Carver raised his hand at $300, and that was the last competing bid. $300. The auctioneer looked at the part-for-parts bidder. No movement. He looked at the crowd. No movement. Sold at $300, he said, with the particular tone of a professional who has sold many things for less than they were worth and has learned not to editorialize. Denny borrowed Pete Alderman's trailer to haul it home. Pete Alderman was 63 and had been farming beside Denny for 22 years and considered himself a friend, which was why he lent the trailer without charge and why he felt entitled to say, while helping Denny get the Oliver loaded, "You know that thing hasn't run in 7 years." Denny said he was aware of that. "Parts are going to be a problem," Pete said. Denny allowed that parts might be a factor. The diesel on those 88s, Pete said, settling into it the way a helpful friend will. The injection pump is a known issue. Cost you as much to rebuild the injection pump as you paid for the tractor, and that's if you can find someone who'll touch it. Denny thanked Pete for the information. He drove the trailer home. He unloaded the Oliver into his barn. He returned Pete's trailer. He went inside for supper. After supper, he went back to the barn and spent an hour walking around the 88 with a flashlight, making notes in the small spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket for exactly these purposes. He did not share the notes with anyone. Part 2. What the flashlight found. There are things you can learn about a tractor in the first hour with a flashlight that will tell you whether you've made a reasonable decision or a foolish one. Denny Carver had 32 years of looking at farm equipment. He was 54 years old in 1996, had been farming since he was 22 on ground his father left him and ground he'd added over the years, and had bought and sold and repaired and used enough equipment in 3 decades to have developed the particular competence that comes from not having the money to hire someone else to know things. When you fix your own equipment for 30 years, you learn equipment, not academically, not from manuals, though manuals are useful. You learn it the way you learn anything that matters, by doing it, making mistakes, correcting the mistakes, and doing it again. The first thing the flashlight confirmed was the engine condition. He pulled the oil dipstick. The oil was dark, but not black, and it was at the correct level, which meant whoever had last serviced this machine before putting it away had put clean oil in and left it full. Good sign. He looked at the oil on the stick. No coolant contamination visible. No unusual metallic sheen. He put a bar to the crankshaft and turned the engine over manually. It turned, stiff from years of sitting, but it turned without the grinding that would indicate scoring, and the compression resistance when the pistons came up on compression stroke felt even across what he could assess by feel. The cooling system had been drained before storage. He could tell from the condition of the petcock, which had been left open and was dry. Intentional draining, done by someone who understood that water left in an Ohio machine over multiple winters would crack a block. Lester Schlabach had known what he was doing when he put this machine away. The fuel system was the question. He pulled the fuel line at the injection pump inlet and looked at it with the flashlight. Dark sediment at the bottom of what he could see in the line. Not unexpected, but not catastrophic. The tank itself he'd deal with separately. The injection pump was the critical unknown, and Pete was right that it was the critical unknown on any diesel that had been sitting this long. He looked at the external condition of the pump. No cracks, no visible seals that had disintegrated and leaked diesel across the surface of the pump body, which would have told him the internal seals were gone. Internal seals on a pump that had been sitting in a dry barn in drained condition had a reasonable chance of being intact. Reasonable, not certain. That was the honest assessment. He looked at the sheet metal, which was the one area where the Oliver had the most to answer for. The hood had a long crack across the top, repaired at some point with a weld that had been done correctly. Not beautiful, but done correctly. The left front fender was dented but intact. The right front fender was the original unit in remarkably good condition for a 42-year-old tractor that had worked hard. The radiator surround was solid. The battery box was rusted, but the box itself was structurally sound. He looked at the frame. He looked at the front axle and the pivot point. He looked at the rear axle and the final drives. He got low and looked at the belly of the machine and at the drawbar and at the 3-point hitch linkage. He wrote things in the spiral notebook. At the end of the hour, he stood in the barn and looked at the Oliver 88 under the barn light and made his assessment. He had paid $300 for a machine that, with work, had a reasonable probability of running and working again. The work would not be cheap in parts, though he'd do the labor himself. The critical variable was the injection pump, and he wouldn't know about the injection pump until he got into it. He went inside and told his wife, Lorraine, that he thought the tractor was going to be all right. Lorraine, who had been married to Denny Carver for 28 years and had learned to read his assessments accurately, said okay, and went back to what she was doing. Part 3. The Talk of Pickaway County. The talk started the way talk in farming communities starts. At the feed store, at the elevator, in the parking lot after church. in the particular circulating way of information in places where everyone knows everyone and the news travels before the event is finished. The basic story was simple. Denny Carver had paid $300 for an Oliver 88 diesel that hadn't run in 7 years, parts were unavailable, the injection pump was a known disaster, and Denny had apparently lost whatever judgment he'd been operating with for 32 years. That was the simple version. The version that circulated also had embellishments, the way these things do. One version had Denny paying $500, another had the tractor not running since 1980 rather than 1989. A third had the rear axle seals gone and leaking, which was not something Denny had mentioned to anyone, because Denny hadn't mentioned anything to anyone. Pete Alderman, who was the closest thing the story had to a primary source, gave his version at the elevator on the Tuesday after the sale. He told it accurately. $300, 7 years sitting, his opinion about the injection pump, and concluded with a headshake that communicated the assessment more efficiently than additional words would have. The prevailing opinion among the men who heard Pete's version was that Denny had done something uncharacteristic, and the uncharacteristic thing was probably going to cost him, not ruin him. Denny's farm was solid, had been solid for years, and $300 plus whatever parts cost wasn't going to change that. But it was going to be a waste of time and money that a 54-year-old farmer had better uses for, and there was going to be a rusty Oliver sitting in his barn for the next decade as evidence of a lapse in judgment. That was the community consensus, assembled by the following Saturday. Denny, if he heard any of it, and he probably heard most of it because Lorraine went to the same grocery store as everyone else and these things come back, gave no indication. He went to work. Part 4. The work. He started on a Monday morning in late March, the kind of Ohio spring morning that isn't fully committed to being spring yet. Cold enough to see your breath. Not cold enough to be genuinely unpleasant for a man used to working outdoors. He opened the barn, pulled the Oliver 88 into the light as far as the barn door allowed, and started methodically at the beginning. The fuel tank came out first. He drained what was in it, less than a gallon of very old diesel that had gone to a dark gum-like consistency at the bottom, and took it to the tank cleaning shop in Circleville, who sandblasted it internally, sealed it, and had it back to him in a week. $62. While the tank was out, he replaced the fuel lines. The original rubber had cracked in 3 places when he flexed it, which was expected for 40-year-old fuel line, and new lines were cheap and important. He rebuilt the fuel filter housing. He replaced the sediment bowl. The injection pump was next, because the injection pump was the thing that would tell him whether the project made sense or not. He pulled it from the engine, a job requiring patience and a specific sequence of steps that he'd found in a service manual he'd ordered from an Oliver specialist in Illinois. $14 plus shipping, one of the best $14 investments he'd ever made. He took the pump to a diesel injection shop in Columbus that an IH mechanic in Circleville had recommended, a shop that worked on vintage diesel fuel systems and knew what they were doing. He left the pump and his phone number and waited. The call came back 4 days later. The shopman's name was Horvath, and he'd been in the diesel injection business for 30 years, and his voice on the phone had the particular flatness of a man who has learned to deliver news without editorializing. The pump seals had survived the storage, not in perfect condition. They were original seals from 1954 and they showed their age, but intact. The internal components were serviceable. The calibration was off, which was expected after 40 years of use and 7 years of sitting. Horvath could rebuild and recalibrate it. The price was $180. Denny said to do it. The pump came back in 2 weeks. He reinstalled it. He filled the tank with fresh diesel. He bled the fuel system, which the service manual walked him through in specific detail. He checked the battery, dead, which was expected, and connected a charger to the battery terminals with the battery from his own truck while he finished the fuel system work. He checked the coolant system for cracks before refilling it. No cracks. He filled it with a fresh antifreeze mix. He checked the oil. He'd already seen it was clean, but he changed it anyway because it was 42-year-old oil, and the cost of fresh oil was less than the risk. He set the throttle and the choke in the positions the service manual recommended for a cold start on a diesel that had been sitting for an extended period. He tried to start it. It didn't start the first day. He adjusted the injection pump timing based on the service manual specifications. He checked the glow plugs. 3 of the 6 were not drawing current, and he replaced all 6 while he was in there. He tried again the next morning. It started not cleanly. It ran rough for 15 minutes, smoked heavily, and sounded like a machine waking up from a long sleep, which was exactly what it was. But it ran. The diesel engine settled gradually into something smoother as it warmed. The smoke began to clear. The idle steadied. Denny stood in the barn door and listened to it for a long time. The Oliver 88 diesel had a particular sound that was its own, different from the IH diesels he was familiar with, different from the John Deere 2-cylinders some of the older men in the county still ran. It had a quality he couldn't quite describe, a steady authority that the engine produced at idle without working for it. He thought, that is what a well-engineered thing sounds like when it is running correctly. He let it run for an hour and then shut it off and checked everything again. Oil pressure, temperature, all the things you check on a machine that has just come back from a long rest. Nothing alarming. He started it again the next morning. It started better. The smoke was less. The idle was steadier. The rings were beginning to seat. He drove it around the yard. He put it in gear. He worked through the transmission. The Oliver 88's transmission was a 6-speed, smooth and deliberate, and found everything engaged and released as it should. He drove it out to the back field. The total he'd spent, counting the sale price and all the parts, and the pump rebuild, $648. He had a running, working 1952 Oliver 88 diesel for $648. And nobody in Pickaway County knew it was running yet, because Denny hadn't told anyone. Part 5. What he found. Inside. This is the part of the story that Denny didn't tell for almost 3 years. Not because it was a secret exactly. He just didn't volunteer it, and nobody asked in the specific way that would have produced the specific answer. People assumed the Oliver project had gone the way they'd expected, that it had turned into a money pit or a parts problem or a thing that sat in the barn reminding him of a poor decision. And Denny didn't correct the assumption. He didn't lie either. He just didn't bring it up. What he'd found was this. When he pulled the hood for the fuel system work in that first week, he'd noticed something about the engine tag. The tag on the Oliver 88 carried the serial number and the basic specification information, as was standard. But this one had an additional notation stamped below the standard information. A 2-letter code followed by a number sequence that wasn't part of the standard serial format. He didn't know what it meant at the time. He wrote it down in the spiral notebook. He filed it and went on with the work because the work was what mattered, and the notation could wait. In June, after the tractor was running and he'd used it for the first cultivation pass on his cornfield, he wrote a letter to the Oliver Collectors Association, an organization he'd found mentioned in the service manual he'd bought from the Illinois specialist, and described the notation on the engine tag, including the exact code and number sequence he'd transcribed. He got a response 6 weeks later from a man who ran a historical research project for the organization, a retired engineer from Dayton who had spent 20 years piecing together Oliver's production records from the factory documentation that had survived the various corporate transitions. The letter was 4 pages. Denny read it 3 times. The 2-letter code on the engine tag, the retired engineer explained, indicated that this particular 88 had been part of a field evaluation program that Oliver had run in the early 1950s to validate the reliability of the diesel engine design before committing to full production. The program had used a small number of tractors. The engineer had records indicating 42 units had been included, that were built with specific additional measurement points and tighter component tolerances, and had been placed on selected farms in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois for monitored field use. The Schlabach farm in Pickaway County had been one of the evaluation sites. The 42 tractors from the evaluation program had been individually tracked by Oliver's engineering department for the first 5 years of the program. The tracking records, which the retired engineer had partially recovered from corporate archives during the AGCO acquisition, showed that each unit's maintenance history and performance data had been reported back to the factory on a quarterly basis during those first 5 years. Denny's serial number, the number from the tag on the barn floor in Pickaway County, appeared in those records. The retired engineer knew the tractor's complete maintenance history from 1952 through 1957 from the Oliver factory records. He could see, from those records, what had been done to the engine during that evaluation period and what condition it had been certified in at the end of the formal evaluation. He could see that the engine had been certified at the end of the evaluation period as performing within factory specification in all measured parameters. He was, the letter said, highly confident that this was a historically significant unit, being one of the documented evaluation fleet from Oliver's pre-production diesel validation program. He knew of 4 others that had been positively identified. Denny's would be the 5th. He asked if Denny would be willing to provide additional documentation, photographs, measurements of specific components, for the historical record. He also told Denny, in the closing paragraph of the letter, that he should be aware that the collector community's interest in documented evaluation fleet tractors was substantial, and that if Denny ever chose to make the tractor available to a collector, he should contact the organization before accepting any offers, because they maintained a network of serious buyers who would understand the machine's significance. Denny folded the letter. He put it in the steel filing cabinet in his farm office. In a manila folder he labeled with the Oliver's serial number. He went out and ran the second cultivation pass on the cornfield. He did not mention the letter to anyone. Not to Lorraine, not immediately. He told her that evening at the kitchen table, and she listened with the same steady attention she gave everything important. And she asked 2 questions, and he answered them. And she said, "What are you going to do?" And he said he didn't know yet, and that was the honest truth. He was not going to do anything in a hurry. He had learned in 54 years that decisions made in a hurry about things that matter are usually worse than decisions that sit for a while and get thought through. The tractor had already waited 42 years from the day it was built to the day he bought it. It could wait a little longer while he figured out what was right. Part 6. The 3 years nobody knew from the summer of 1996 through the winter of 1998, Denny Carver farmed with the Oliver 88. He used it for the secondary field work, pulling the grain cart, working the ground in the fall, doing the jobs that didn't require maximum horsepower, but required a reliable second tractor that didn't need to go back to the dealer for a computer diagnostic when something small went wrong. The 88 was that second tractor, and it was good at it. The engine ran cleanly and without complaint. The transmission, the 6-speed that he'd worked through carefully that first day in the yard, never gave him a moment's trouble. Pete Alderman, who farmed beside him and had lent him the trailer and had told him about the injection pump, saw the Oliver in the field that first fall and stopped his truck on the road and watched it for a while and then drove on without saying anything. He mentioned to his wife that evening that apparently Denny had gotten the thing running. His wife said she'd heard it was broken down in the barn. Pete said apparently not. The community's revised assessment, once it became clear the Oliver was actually working, was muted and brief. The acknowledgement that Denny had pulled it off, delivered with the particular economical recognition that farming communities give to people who were right about something the community had decided they were wrong about. It was not a parade. It was more like a collective slight nod, which in Pickaway County was plenty. But Denny still hadn't mentioned the letter, or the evaluation program, or the 4-page response from the retired engineer in Dayton, or the manila folder in the filing cabinet with the Oliver's serial number on the tab. He had been corresponding with the retired engineer, whose name was Fielding. They exchanged letters 4 times that first year, Fielding asking for photographs and measurements, Denny providing them, Fielding responding with increasingly detailed historical context about the evaluation program and where Denny's tractor fit within it. Fielding had, by the end of 1996, documented Denny's 88 comprehensively and had included it in the historical record of the evaluation fleet. He had also, in his December 1996 letter, provided Denny with a specific number, not a price. Fielding was careful to say it was not a formal appraisal, and he was not a licensed appraiser. But he said, based on the comparable sales of the 2 identified evaluation fleet tractors that had changed hands in collector transactions over the previous 3 years, he believed the fair market value of a documented 5th unit in running condition was substantially above the $4,000 level and potentially approaching or exceeding $6,000 depending on the condition and the buyer. Denny read that sentence several times. He did the math. He had paid $300 for the tractor and $648 total when you included the pump rebuild and the other parts. Just under $950 all in. If Fielding's number was even directionally accurate, the margin was. He stopped doing the math. He wasn't ready to think about it in those terms. He still had to decide what he was going to do, and he wasn't going to decide based on numbers alone. He put the December letter in the manila folder with the others and went to make sure the barn was locked for the night. Part 7. The Conversation with Lorraine. Lorraine, Carver is a woman who does not push. She has her opinions, and she states them when asked, or when not stating them, would be a failure of the relationship, but she does not push, which was one of the things Denny had known about her from the beginning, and which had made him want to marry her. A man who doesn't talk about things until he's ready to talk about them needs a partner who understands that the not talking is not evasion, it's process. In February of 1998, a year and a half after the sale, after 2 full seasons of farming with the Oliver, Lorraine asked at the kitchen table after supper whether Denny had decided anything about the tractor. He looked at her. She looked at him. This was a conversation they'd been not having for 18 months, and they both knew it. He got up and got the manila folder from the filing cabinet. He put it on the table and talked her through it. The engine tag notation, the letter to the Oliver Collectors Association, the response from Fielding, the subsequent correspondence, the documentation that had been assembled, and Fielding's number from the December 1996 letter. Lorraine listened without interrupting. This was her practice. She listened to the whole thing before she spoke, which meant that when she spoke it addressed the actual substance rather than the part she'd heard before he'd finished. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What does it mean to you?" she asked. Denny thought about that. "The tractor earned its keep for 2 years, he said. "It did the work I bought it to do. It's a good machine and I'd be content running it another 10 years. But it's also something that a collector values for reasons that have nothing to do with how useful it is to me as a working farmer. And keeping a historically significant machine on a working farm, not restoring it, not preserving it, might not be the right place for it in the long run." Lorraine nodded. "So you're thinking about selling?" "I'm thinking about it." "Do you feel right about it?" He thought about that honestly. "I feel right about the price I paid for it and the work I did in the 2 years I got out of it," he said. "If I sell it for what Fielding thinks it's worth, it goes to someone who will preserve it correctly and put it in the historical record. That feels right." Lorraine said, "Then you should sell it." He called Fielding the following week. Part 8. The Sale and What Came After. Fielding connected him with a collector in the Oliver community, a man from Indiana who had been looking for a documented evaluation fleet unit for several years and who drove to Pickaway County on a Thursday in March of 1998 to look at the tractor. The collector's name was Weiss. He was methodical and thorough, the way serious collectors are. He spent 3 hours with the tractor, going through his own evaluation process, checking Fielding's documentation against the physical machine. At the end of 3 hours, he sat down in Denny's barn on the same kind of overturned 5-gallon bucket that seems to appear in every farm barn transaction scene and made Denny an offer. It was above Fielding's number. Not dramatically above, but above. Denny said he'd think about it. Weiss said he'd wait. Denny thought about it for 2 days. He drove the Oliver around the yard once more, the diesel engine starting cleanly on the second compression cycle, the transmission running through all 6 gears without hesitation, the machine running the way it had run for 2 full seasons of field work. He parked it and shut it off and sat for a moment. $300, 3 years ago, in front of a crowd of people who'd already decided what it was. He went inside and called Weiss and said he'd take the offer. The Oliver 88 left the Carver farm on a Saturday morning in late March of 1998, loaded on Weiss's trailer, headed for a collection in Indiana where it would be properly documented, conserved, and eventually displayed. It has been written about in 2 Oliver Collector publications. Its evaluation fleet status is recorded in the Oliver Historical Registry maintained by the Collectors Association. The total Denny received was not a number he stated publicly, but the math, when you worked it from what was known, $300 at the sale, $950 total invested, Fielding's estimate of $6,000 plus, Weiss's offer above that number, The math suggested that Denny Carver had turned a $300 investment into something that covered a meaningful piece of his annual operating costs. He didn't say that. He didn't say much about it at all. He mentioned to Pete Alderman, after the trailer had been gone an hour, that he'd sold the Oliver. Pete asked what he'd gotten for it. Denny said he'd done all right. Pete waited. Denny didn't add anything. Pete went home and told his wife that Denny had sold the Oliver and done all right, and his wife said she'd heard it was a piece of junk, and Pete said apparently not. The money went into the farm, the way farm money should. Seed costs and operating expenses, and a portion against the equipment note he'd been carrying on the combine. It disappeared into the machinery of the operation the way unexpected money always does when the person receiving it is a farmer, not into a celebration or a purchase of something unnecessary, but into the ongoing costs of keeping a farm running, which are considerable and perpetual and do not pause to acknowledge the arrival of unexpected funds. Part 9. What Pete finally asked. It was 2 years later, 2000, a June evening, both men leaning on the fence at the edge of Denny's east field watching the corn come in, that Pete Alderman finally asked the question he'd been working up to since March of 1998. "What did you actually know about that Oliver when you bought it?" Pete said. Denny kept looking at the corn. "I knew it had been stored right," he said. "Whoever put it away knew what they were doing. Tank drained, oil in, petcock open. It had been put to sleep correctly, not just abandoned." Pete nodded. "And the injection pump. I told you about the injection pump." "You did. Didn't scare you off?" "No." Pete was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know it was going to be okay?" Denny looked at the corn for a while. "I didn't know," he said. "I thought the odds were better than the crowd thought they were. The pump seals on a diesel that's been stored dry and drained have a chance of being intact, not a guarantee. A chance. I thought the chance was worth $300. Pete thought about that. "But it turned out to be worth a lot more than $300, he said. "Was that the plan?" Denny looked at him. "I found something on the engine tag the first week I had it," he said. "Wrote to the Oliver Collectors people. Turned out to be a history on it." He didn't elaborate further than that. Pete waited, the way you wait when you're hoping someone will tell you more. Denny looked back at the corn. "Well," Pete said after a while, "you did all right." "I paid attention," Denny said. "That's all." They watched the corn in the evening light for a while longer. Then Pete drove home and Denny walked back to the barn, and that was the whole conversation. Part 10. The philosophy of not telling people have asked Denny Carver over the years, after the story eventually circulated in the fuller version, as these things eventually do, why he didn't say anything. Why he let the community think he'd made a bad decision when he knew, or suspected strongly, that he hadn't. Why he let Pete's elevator conversation run on for 2 years without correcting it. He has 2 answers. He usually gives the shorter one first. The shorter answer is that he wasn't certain, for the first several months, that he was right. The injection pump might have been ruined. The engine might not have come back from 7 years of sitting. The notation on the engine tag might have been nothing. Right up until Fielding's letter arrived in August of 1996 and told him specifically what he had. There had been a real possibility that Pete and the rest of them were correct. You don't correct people's wrong conclusions when those conclusions might turn out to be right. The longer answer is more complicated and more honest, and Denny gives it less often, only to people he's decided deserve it. The longer answer is that what other people thought about his decision was not, ultimately, his concern. Not because he was indifferent to his community. He was not. He had lived among these people his whole life, and valued the relationships and the history. But the decision was his, made on his assessment of the available information, and whether the community consensus agreed with his assessment was irrelevant to whether his assessment was correct. If he was right, the result would say so eventually. If he was wrong, the result would say that. In neither case did the community's opinion change the outcome. He had paid $300 and his own labor and attention. He had gotten back a running tractor that worked for 2 years, and then a fair price when it went to a collection where its history was preserved. The opinion of the men at the elevator in Circleville in the spring of 1996 had not been a factor in any step of that process. That was the philosophy, not arrogance, Denny Carver is not an arrogant man. It is something quieter than arrogance. It is the confidence of a man who has learned, over a farming lifetime, to trust his own assessments over the crowd's assessments, not because he is always right and the crowd is always wrong, but because his assessments are based on specific knowledge and attention, and the crowds are often based on reputation and assumption and the path of least resistance. The Oliver had a bad reputation in 1996 among people who didn't know Oliver specifically. Denny had been willing to look past the reputation at the actual machine. That was the whole difference. That was the entirety of it. Epilogue. The barn in winter. Denny Carver is 78 years old now. He retired from active farming at 70, handing the operation to his son-in-law, who had married his daughter and had the good sense to come back to the farm rather than take her away from it. He still lives on the place. He still walks the fields in the morning when his hips cooperate. He still goes into the barn. The barn is different than it was in 1996. Newer equipment in there now mostly. But in the back corner where the Oliver stood for 2 years, there's a cleared space that nothing has permanently occupied since the trailer took it away. Not intentionally cleared, it's just that nothing has quite needed that exact corner for anything permanent. Things get stored there temporarily and moved. He has a photograph that Fielding sent him, a professional photograph taken at a regional collector show in 2004, showing the Oliver 88 restored to as new condition, the olive green Oliver paint correct and clean. The evaluation fleet tag mounted on a small display board beside the tractor, identifying it as unit number 31 of 42 in the original program. The tractor looks like it looked in 1952 when Lester Schlabach drove it home from the dealer for the first time. It looks like something cared for. Denny keeps the photograph in the filing cabinet in the manila folder with the Fielding correspondence and the Oliver serial number on the tab. He doesn't take it out often, but it's there. His son-in-law asked him once what the lesson of the Oliver story was. He was asking because he was a smart young man who understood that Denny had lessons worth extracting and that the extracting required asking directly. Denny thought about it. "Don't let someone else's assessment replace your own," he said. "Not when you can assess for yourself. Go look at the thing. Read the engine tag. Check if the oil is clean. Figure out whether the person who stored it knew what they were doing." He paused. "The crowd is often wrong, not always and not about everything, but often enough that you can't afford to just accept the crowd's verdict without looking yourself." The son-in-law nodded. He had a notebook with him. He usually had a notebook, and he wrote something in it. Denny saw him writing and said, "Your notebook won't help you as much as your flashlight." The son-in-law looked up. "Information helps," Denny said. "But you have to go look. The looking is the thing. You can't outsource the looking." The son-in-law closed the notebook. He thought about that. "What if you look and you're wrong?" he asked. Denny said, "Then you're wrong on your own judgment and you learn something. That's better than being wrong because you didn't look and you believe someone else." He went back inside. The barn was quiet in the winter afternoon. The equipment along the walls, the empty corner in the back where the Oliver had stood, the barn light casting the same shadows it always had. Outside, his son-in-law stood in the yard for a moment, notebook in his coat pocket, thinking about looking. Then he went to find a flashlight. End. Expansion. Part 2. Continuation. The details that mattered. There are men who look at machinery the way tourists look at monuments, seeing the general impression, taking away the obvious, moving on with a settled opinion that has very little to do with the specific reality of what they looked at. And there are men who look at machinery the way a doctor looks at a patient, systematically, specifically, with a mental checklist running against everything they observe, looking not for what they hope to see, but for what is actually there. Denny Carver was the second kind. He had developed this quality over decades of fixing his own equipment on a farm operation that couldn't afford to make bad decisions about machinery, and it had become so habitual that he didn't think of it as a skill. It was simply how he looked at things. What he saw on the Oliver 88 that first evening with the flashlight, beyond the general assessment he'd made, was a collection of specific details that told a story about the machine's history. He read them the way a man reads tracks in mud. not as individual marks but as a connected narrative. The weld on the hood crack, for instance. He looked at it carefully. The weld had been done with a MIG welder by someone who knew what they were doing. The bead was consistent, the penetration was good, the repair was structurally sound rather than cosmetic. Lester Schlabach, or someone in his family or employ, had paid for the right repair on the hood, rather than the cheap one. That told Denny something about how the machine had been maintained overall. People who do the right repair on the parts that don't show tend to do the right repair on the parts that do. The condition of the grease fittings told him something too. He ran his fingers over each one he could reach in the first circuit. They were intact, not broken off, not left to accumulate decades of crud. Somebody had been greasing this machine on a schedule. Regular greasing of the fittings meant regular attention to the machine's maintenance overall. A machine that gets greased on schedule gets oil changes on schedule and belt tension checks on schedule and tire pressure checks on schedule. The maintenance culture of a farm operation is consistent, and you can read the whole culture from any individual detail if you know what you're looking at. The tire condition was interesting. The rear tires were original. He could tell from the tread pattern, which was an older Oliver spec agricultural tread that hadn't been produced in that exact pattern since the mid-1960s. They were cracked somewhat, as you'd expect, but the cracks were surface cracks in the sidewall rubber that came from UV exposure and age, not from improper storage or excessive flexing. The tires had been stored in a barn, out of direct sun, inflated to a reasonable pressure. He could see from the flat spots that they'd been left sitting for years, but the flat spots would work out with use. The tires were not destroyed. The key was still in the ignition. This was a small thing, but Denny noted it. A machine that's truly abandoned, left because the owner gave up, left because it failed catastrophically, left because it became a problem rather than a tool, often has its key gone. The key goes somewhere, into a drawer or a box or simply lost. A machine that's put away, deliberately stored, by someone who expected it to be used again someday, tends to have its key where the key belongs. The key was in the ignition. He couldn't see into the fuel tank without draining it, but he could smell the filler cap. Stale diesel, gummy from evaporation, which was what he expected after years of sitting. Not the smell of water, which would have told him someone had left water in the tank, either through condensation that wasn't managed or through neglect of the drain. The smell told him the tank had been left with some diesel in it that had gone bad, not with water, a distinction that mattered. He spent 45 minutes on details before he did the crankshaft bar-over test. By the time he put the bar to the crankshaft, he already had a reasonably strong picture of what he was dealing with. A machine that had been well maintained during its working life and well stored when it was put away, now subject to the ordinary deterioration of time, rather than the specific deterioration of neglect or abuse. Those are very different things. And the difference between them is often the difference between a machine that comes back and one that doesn't. He wrote all of this in the spiral notebook, not in narrative form, in the shorthand of a man who would read his own notes and needed only the triggers to reconstruct the full assessment. Hood crack weld, correct repair, good penetration, grease fittings, intact, clean, rear tires, original tread, surface cracks, stored upright, key in ignition, and so on. He filled 3 pages that first evening. Expansion, Part 3. Continuation. The feed store verdicts. The talk at the feed store had a quality to it that Denny's purchases didn't usually generate, because Denny's purchases were not usually the kind of purchases that generated talk. He was known in Pickaway County as a solid farmer and a careful buyer, someone who didn't make dramatic moves, someone whose decisions you might not notice in the moment, but whose operation consistently performed. He wasn't the kind of man people gossiped about because there wasn't usually anything to gossip about. The Oliver 88 was an exception, and because it was an exception, people engaged with it more enthusiastically than they might have with a more typical Denny Carver decision. The conversation at the elevator on the Tuesday after the sale, Pete's version, delivered accurately, was the primary text. What circulated from there were commentaries on the primary text, each adding a layer of interpretation. A man named Forsyth, who farmed the ground north of town and fancied himself an equipment expert because he'd bought and sold a fair amount of machinery over the years, delivered what was considered the most authoritative secondary opinion. He told the grain elevator manager, a man who talked to everyone, that the injection pump on an Oliver 88 diesel that had been sitting 7 years was categorically not salvageable without a complete rebuild that would cost more than the tractor was worth on a good day, and that anyone who thought otherwise was fooling themselves. This opinion circulated with Forsyth's name attached, which gave it weight, because Forsyth was not shy about his opinions, and people had learned to credit him on equipment matters even when they shouldn't have. The grain elevator manager mentioned Forsyth's opinion to 3 people that week, each of whom mentioned it to 2 more, and by Thursday of that week the specific claim that the injection pump was definitively unsalvageable had become a fact in the community's shared understanding, despite having no basis other than Forsyth's confident assertion and no testing to support it. This is how community opinion works. It is not a deliberate process of misinformation. It is the natural tendency of people who share information through oral transmission to treat confident assertion as tested fact, especially when the asserter has a reputation for knowing things, and especially when the assertion confirms what people already believe they know about the subject. What Forsyth actually knew about the Oliver 88's injection pump specifically was less than what he projected. He knew that diesel injection pumps were expensive to rebuild. True. He knew that Oliver parts were hard to find through normal dealership channels. True in 1996, though the situation was better through specialist suppliers than Forsyth was aware. He had not examined this specific pump. He had not contacted a diesel injection shop. He had not read a service manual for the Oliver 88 diesel. He had applied general principles to a specific situation without the specific information required to make the application accurate. Denny knew Forsyth. He valued Forsyth's general farm knowledge and had found it useful over the years on certain topics. He also knew that Forsyth's knowledge of Oliver's specifically was general and dated, based on things he'd heard rather than things he'd done. He had taken Forsyth's warning, delivered to Pete in Denny's presence at the sale, less formally than the elevator version, as one data point among several, weighted appropriately. He gave it no more weight than it deserved and no less. That was the discipline. Expansion. Part 5. Continuation. The Fielding correspondence in full. The correspondence between Denny and Fielding over the course of 1996 and into 1997 was, for Denny, one of the more remarkable experiences of his farming life. Not because he was easily impressed, he wasn't, but because Fielding's knowledge of the Olivers' specific history was of a precision and depth that Denny had not encountered in any other context related to farm equipment. Fielding had spent 20 years as an engineer at a Dayton manufacturing firm, not an agricultural company, a precision machining operation, and had retired in 1986 and immediately turned his full engineering attention to the historical documentation of Oliver tractors, particularly the diesel development program of the early 1950s. He had corresponded with former Oliver engineers. He had tracked down corporate archive materials through the various entities that had owned the Oliver brand. He had located and documented 8 evaluation fleet tractors over 2 decades of searching, and Denny's was the 9th. He knew the specific engine that had gone into Denny's tractor. He had the original test results from the evaluation period, the compression readings, the oil consumption measurements, the drawbar pull figures, all recorded in the quarterly reports that the Schlebach farm had submitted to Oliver's engineering department in Dayton from 1952 through 1957. He could tell Denny what the tractor had measured in each category when it was new and when it completed the formal evaluation period, and he could compare those numbers to the design specification for the standard production engine, and the comparison showed that the evaluation fleet engines had been built to tolerances approximately 15% tighter than the standard specification on the critical wear surfaces. This explained, Fielding wrote, why this engine had survived 42 years in productive use and 7 years of storage in better condition than a standard production unit from the same era might have. The tighter tolerances at build meant more material, more precision, and a longer useful life before wear reached the point of affecting performance. It was the engineering logic behind why you'd build an evaluation fleet to tighter tolerances. You wanted the results to reflect the design's potential rather than manufacturing variation. Denny read this passage and thought about the crankshaft bar-over test from his first evening with the tractor. The even compression resistance he'd felt across all 6 cylinders, the absence of the dragging or scoring that would have indicated serious wear. He had interpreted that as evidence of good storage. It was also, he now understood, evidence of good original build quality. Both things together, the good build and the good storage, had produced a machine that had come back from 7 years of sitting with less difficulty than its reputation might have suggested. He wrote this observation to Fielding, who responded with a letter that began, "You've identified something that most people who hear this story miss." Fielding went on to explain that the Oliver 88's general reputation for reliability was real. It was a well-built machine by the standards of its era, but that the evaluation fleet units were a level above the general production because they had been specifically built to show what the design could do when manufactured to full specification. The evaluation fleet, Fielding wrote, was Oliver saying to itself, "This is what the best version of this engine looks like." The general production was Oliver saying to its customers, "This is a reliable, well-built machine." Both statements were true. They were not, however, describing the same object. Denny filed this letter with the others. He thought about it over the following days, driving the tractor, working the cultivator through the corn, listening to the diesel engine do its work with the steady authority that he'd noticed from the first day it ran. He was running the evaluation fleet version, the best version. In a field in Pickaway County, Ohio, 42 years after it had been built to show what Oliver could do. He didn't tell anyone this either. Not then. The corn was coming in, and the telling could wait. Expansion. Part 8. Continuation. Pete's understanding. Pete Alderman thought about the conversation at the fence line for several days after June of 2000. Not obsessively. Pete was not an obsessive man, but it kept surfacing when his mind was unoccupied, the way unresolved questions will. What he came back to was the thing Denny had said about the odds. "I thought the odds were better than the crowd thought they were." That was the honest answer to Pete's honest question, and Pete recognized it as honest, and that was partly why it kept surfacing. He had been at the Pickaway County sale. He had been the one who loaded the trailer. He had told Denny about the injection pump problem. Not incorrect information, as it turned out, since the pump had needed a rebuild, just not as expensive or as hopeless a rebuild as Pete had implied. He had been one of the people whose judgment had been wrong. He wasn't troubled by having been wrong. Farming requires you to make dozens of assessments every season, and being wrong on some of them is built into the math. What troubled him, slightly, was the mechanism of his wrongness. He had repeated what he'd heard, the Oliver reputation, the injection pump warning, without examining the specific machine in the specific condition he had helped load onto a trailer. He'd been within 30 feet of the tractor for 40 minutes, and he had not looked at it the way Denny had looked at it. He thought about what he would have seen if he had looked. He'd seen the tractor, the rough condition, the missing seat, the flat rear tire. But he hadn't looked at the weld on the hood crack. He hadn't checked if the grease fittings were intact. He hadn't noticed whether the key was in the ignition. He hadn't put his nose near the fuel filler cap to smell whether it was diesel or water. He hadn't done any of the specific things that would have told him what Denny had assembled into an assessment in the first hour in the barn. He mentioned this to his wife one evening, trying to explain why the conversation at the fence line was still bothering him. She listened and said, "So Denny looked and you didn't." Pete said that was about the size of it. His wife said, "What are you going to do about that?" Pete thought about it. "Look more," he said. His wife went back to her book. Pete sat in his chair and thought about looking more, and about what it would cost to develop the habit Denny had, and about whether at 67 years old he had the time and the inclination to become a different kind of looker. He decided he had enough time for one improvement, and this was a useful one. He bought a flashlight the following week. A good one. He put it in his truck where he'd have it when he needed it. He used it the following spring at a sale in Fayette County, going over a used field cultivator he was thinking about buying. He found a cracked toolbar that wasn't visible in normal light but was clear under the flashlight beam at the right angle. He passed on the cultivator. He saved himself, by his later estimate, about $400 in repair costs. He thought about Denny when he walked away from it. about looking and not looking and the difference between them. He still has the flashlight. He uses it every time.